With the release of Star Wars Episode 9, many fans have been left wondering how a company as successful as Disney could have fumbled the handling of such a beloved franchise. And as such, many of us can't help but think about how things would have turned out if Disney had taken more care to craft and plan out a proper story. A story that served to introduce new characters, to expand the known cinematic universe, and that honored and dignified what came before. In this video, I'd like to compare Disney's attempts to resurrect the Star Wars franchise to their efforts to do the same with the Tron sequel. There are actually a lot of similarities between these two attempts at soft reboots. Both were taken from classic science fiction movies that were released in the early 80s. Both were considered ahead of their time and groundbreaking in many respects for their visual effects and storytelling. They also served as continuations of their original stories with very similar plots and story elements. Both the Star Wars and Tron sequels feature a plot that is driven by a search for the former main protagonist who has disappeared, who then are found living in isolation. Both of them follow the actions of the descendants of the main characters from the originals, who are now featured as the new main characters. They also both feature strong female leads. Another similarity was how the music was used in the storytelling. Tron Legacy famously featured a fantastic soundtrack by Daft Punk that many argue eclipsed the movie in its fame and success. It was also a no-brainer for Disney to bring back John Williams, as he is synonymous with Star Wars, and his music has been just as much, if not more, of a beloved character in the franchise as any other. Both of these continuations introduce a villain who has fallen from grace due, in part, to a lapse in judgment or mistake by a legacy character. There are many other minor similarities, but those are just a few examples of how similar these plots are. What I find interesting is where these stories differ. First of all, and probably the biggest difference, and the factor that contributed the most in my mind to the success or failure of these soft reboot attempts, were the setup for character motivations, and how that translated into how the legacy characters were treated. In comparing Mark Hamill's Luke Skywalker to Jeff Bridges' Kevin Flynn, they had both chosen to exile themselves, but the reason given for Flynn's isolation was far more noble and fit into what we already knew about his character. In Tron Legacy, we discover that Flynn was trapped on the grid after Clue had turned against him, and his isolation was motivated out of self-preservation and to protect the last ISO, Cora, who, if she was able to get outside the grid, would be able to tremendously help human society. So he took a classic Flynn-like, meditative, waited-out approach. In The Last Jedi, we find that Luke has also isolated himself. This was because of his nephew, Ben Solo's, turn to the dark side. Luke says that he went to the island of Ahch-To, exiling himself, waiting to die, and didn't seem to care at all about what happened to the rest of the inhabitants of the galaxy. By taking this approach, many fans were surprised to see how one of the most beloved and hopeful characters in the Star Wars universe had turned so callous, dejected, and uncaring. After all, Luke, after seeing a glimmer of light in Darth Vader, was ready to sacrifice himself in order to help redeem his father. And here he had turned into a character that, after seeing a glimmer of darkness in his nephew, ignited his lightsaber with the inclination to kill him. This approach couldn't be further from what we knew about Luke Skywalker, and is probably the most controversial decision to come out of the Disney trilogy so far. Following the shocking death of another legacy character, Han Solo, this decision to warp Luke into something that is so out of character in the eyes of many fans was definitely a big contributing factor to the failure of this trilogy. Another similarity was that both of these characters came out of exile to save the new protagonists. When Flynn showed up for the first time on the grid to save Sam and Cora at the end of Wine Club, it was truly an epic moment. The same can be said of Flynn's reintegration with Clue to protect them both at the end of the movie. These were moments that added to the legacy of his character. They showcased how powerful he was, and the depth of the love he had for his son to make such a sacrifice. In comparison, Luke was anything but willing to help the Resistance. And when he finally appeared to help the Resistance escape at the Battle of Crate, it turned out to be an illusion. where he was essentially projecting himself as a glorified hologram across the galaxy. And while parts of his appearance were entertaining, it didn't carry nearly as much weight and meaning as Flynn's sacrifice. I don't think anyone was very impressed by the display of this force power, and it didn't seem to add to his legacy at all, as it turned out to be an illusion. Another difference in the two reboot attempts was that while Flynn's sacrifice was meaningful, Luke's death was so sudden and unexpected that it felt unnecessary. We had no idea of the possible consequences of a power like force projection being used, so because we weren't prepared for it, his death seemed confusing as it resulted from seemingly using the force too hard. So it feels less like a sacrifice and more like an unfortunate side effect. This also shows both a good example and a bad example of when and how main characters should be killed off. At the end of Tron Legacy, the reason for Kevin Flynn's sacrifice made sense. He was protecting the world and his son from Clue. They had built up to that sacrifice and foreshadowed it throughout the movie. When Luke dies, it comes as a shock to the audience because they hadn't built up to it, and it was just another example in a long line of expectations being subverted. Add to this the fact that this was the second seemingly useless death on the part of a legacy character, and many fans were understandably disappointed and upset. Another difference was how both franchises handled their new strong female leads. Rey and Cora were both confident and capable, both acting to save Finn and Sam. They also both decided to go against their mentor's advice to stay in isolation and out of danger. Cora respects Flynn as her mentor, but she thought she was doing the right thing for him by going against his orders. This is a big difference in the Disney trilogy as well, because there is not a good relationship between Luke and Rey. It's mostly contentious between them. So when she leaves, it seems to be out of spite and bitterness towards him. Another difference in both characters going against the mentor's advice is that we see Cora get injured as a result of her naivete, having to be saved by Flynn. Rey never really seems to suffer any consequences for the choices she makes, nor is she ever in a position to need rescuing. She's never vulnerable, never suffers any setbacks, and so she is not relatable. Another big difference in these sequel installments is how the audience feels afterwards. After Tron Legacy, I'm left with a feeling of contentment with the ending and wanting to watch it again, and I have seen it countless times since seeing it in the theater. The legacy characters were honored, and it was a worthy sequel. Some fans were hoping for more from the Tron sequel, but the majority were satisfied, and it was not nearly as divisive as the Star Wars sequels are. It was definitely a financial success and worthy of more content, which I hope they choose to continue. On the other hand, the Disney trilogy so far has left a majority of the fan base bewildered, confused, and at a loss as to why they chose to continue the stories of our beloved trio from the original trilogy, portraying them with their lives in shambles, and then killing them off one by one and without giving them the treatment their characters deserved. I myself have only seen The Force Awakens a couple times, and The Last Jedi only once in its entirety, not wanting to relive that experience again. And I have no desire to ever see The Rise of Skywalker because of their refusal to redeem or show respect to the character of Luke Skywalker in any significant way. Can you even imagine if the Tron sequel did not have Kevin Flynn in it in any significant way? It would have turned out way different. And the treatment of the fans is also a big difference here. Actually, this is an area where the Disney trilogy stands alone. I've never seen this before, where a movie studio has blamed the fans for their not liking their movie, instead of taking responsibility for their decisions and try to make things right. Unfortunately, this analysis is more of a post-mortem for the Disney Star Wars trilogy. There's nothing left to be done for this trilogy, even though I'm sure the studio will try to release books and comics to appease the fans' desire to see the legacy characters in action. But for many, that's not nearly enough, and the mistakes they've made with these sequels will significantly impact future projects. They've already shut down several standalone films, and apparently there are no more trilogies ahead according to Kathleen Kennedy. Kevin Feige is rumored to be involved in a future Star Wars movie project. Time will tell whether or not his involvement will bring any fans back into the fold. For many, it will take a lot to make up for the disrespect they have felt from Disney throughout the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Many fans want a regime change first before they will consider coming back. And that might happen, especially if Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau keep having the kind of success they have been with shows like The Mandalorian. The success that show has had is a prime example of the benefits of creating new content in a beloved universe that focuses on respecting what came before. I think the best approach moving forward for Disney, if they want to reignite the passion that has been lost by the fans, would be to take time to develop good stories that deserve to be told. If they actually took a reasonable amount of time to craft good Star Wars stories, and if they were to make adjustments to their storytelling to ensure they respect and expand upon what came before, then I think it's entirely possible that Disney can make up for wasted time and missed opportunities, and they might be able to slowly begin to win over their disheartened fans. I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're here, leave a like and subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and as always, have a very nerdy day.